At 50, maybe 55, you could still turn heads with ease. But there was something more. You'd go out for your morning coffee, and the barista would smile at you in a way that was almost reverent. You'd walk down the street, and strangers would meet your eyes, only to quickly look away, a touch of hesitation lingering in their gaze. Sometimes a younger man would step aside, almost instinctively, allowing you to pass first. Small, polite gestures were all there, too polite, too perfect. It was a quiet kind of attention, nothing overt, nothing that felt too unusual at first. You shrugged it off, chalking it up to good grooming, the confidence that comes with age, and the smooth way you carried yourself. You'd worked hard on your health and appearance over the years. You'd built a persona that matched the strength you'd cultivated inside. Why wouldn't people notice? But then you began noticing the patterns. It wasn't just occasional compliments anymore. It was every time you entered a room, every time you walked into a cafe or store. Eyes would follow you. Conversations would falter, then restart when you walked past. There was something almost choreographed about the way people reacted to you, as if they'd been waiting for you to make your entrance. Why did people look at you with such awe? Why was there an unspoken, subtle reverence in the way they interacted with you? It was as if you weren't just another man. They needed to notice you. They needed to acknowledge you. One day you noticed a small detail that chilled you. As you entered a meeting, the room's energy shifted. The men who usually were competitive, giving off a vibe of superiority, seemed to shift backward in their chairs. Their eyes weren't just on you, they were wide with a kind of respect, even fear. They wouldn't make eye contact, and when you spoke, they hung on every word. And then, just as quickly, they resumed talking, but with a subtle difference. The conversations were more deferential, more favorable. You tried to ignore it, telling yourself it was just your imagination. You even gave yourself a mental pat on the back, thinking perhaps it was your charisma and experience shining through. But that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Every small interaction was beginning to feel like a calculated performance. You couldn't quite explain it, but you felt like you were being watched. Not just by people who admired you, but by something else. Something unseen, maybe something unspoken. And that's when the first inkling hit you. What if the attention you were getting wasn't entirely of your own making? 2. The eyes that never look away. It began to escalate. At first it was a little unsettling, but you brushed it off as paranoia. People looking at you in admiration or curiosity was nothing new. It happened to everyone from time to time, but now it was different. The looks weren't fleeting or polite. They lingered. You noticed it most when you were out in public, the grocery store, on the sidewalk, or even in the subway. Strangers would look at you as though they couldn't look away. Their gazes weren't just passing, they were wide-eyed, as though they were staring at something impossible. People who would usually glance at anyone for a moment and then look away would, instead, lock eyes with you, and you'd find yourself unable to tear your gaze from theirs. It wasn't just attraction, it felt like an almost hypnotic pull. At first you told yourself it was flattering. A little attention never hurt anyone, right? But as it continued, the unease grew. Conversations seemed to freeze when you entered a room, as though the world held its breath. At first it was just a slight delay, a break in the flow of speech, but it soon became more pronounced. People would literally stop mid-sentence, their eyes drawn to you with such intensity that they would forget what they were saying. It was as though you commanded their undivided attention. You tried testing it. One afternoon you walked into a crowded cafe, the sound of chatter filling the air. The moment you stepped through the door, everything grew quieter, like the room had collectively exhaled. The barista's hand froze as she reached for a cup, her eyes locking with yours for a fraction too long. The murmur of voices softened. Then, as quickly as it had started, everything resumed, except now it felt different. The air felt heavier, charged. People looked at you with wide eyes, almost as if waiting for something to happen. It wasn't just inanimate objects that reacted to your presence. People obeyed in subtle ways, as though they were being gently guided. A woman moved aside to let you pass, but her eyes seemed to follow your every step. A young man stood up straight when you walked past, almost as if he was on the verge of saluting. There was no overt interaction, no obvious command. It was more like an instinct, a reflex, something deep within their psyche pulling them toward you. And the oddest part, you hadn't said a word, made a gesture, or done anything to provoke this. The more you paid attention to it, the more the unease gnawed at you. Was this some sort of power you'd unknowingly developed? Or was there something other at work? The certainty that people couldn't tear their eyes away from you deepened, but you couldn't understand why. You were just an older man. Nothing extraordinary. So why did it feel like you were compelling them to look? One evening, you walked down a dimly lit street, the city quiet, the usual hum of traffic and chatter muffled in the background. As you passed a group of strangers, their heads all turned in sync, locking eyes with you. No one spoke, but there was an energy, a tension in the air. It was like they knew something you didn't. They didn't just see you, they recognized you. It was at that moment that a cold chill ran through you. The sensation hit like a wave, sending goosebumps crawling up your skin. And for the first time, you couldn't ignore the growing feeling. Why are they staring at me like that? What do they know that I don't? 3. The vanishing past. The unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of your mind. As the days went on, you couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The strange stares, the inexplicable reverence, the way people seemed to move out of your way. It was all starting to add up, but you still couldn't grasp why. To distract yourself, you decided to revisit your past. Maybe retracing your steps would help make sense of the present. You pulled out old photo albums, dusty boxes of mementos, and faded records from years gone by. At first, it was comforting. There you were, younger, smiling in photographs, sharing moments with family and friends. It was a life well lived, but something was off. The further you dug, the more questions arose. Photos that you had clearly taken or appeared in didn't seem to match the memory you had of the moment. Faces in the background were blurry, their features hard to place, like someone had deliberately altered them. Even your own image in the photos seemed to have a strange, distant quality, as if you weren't fully present. There were gaps. People who should have been in your memories weren't there. Friends, family members. You couldn't recall how or when certain key moments happened. For instance, a picture from a vacation in your late 30s showed you laughing with friends. But none of those friends were familiar to you. They looked like strangers. You went through your old journals hoping to find something concrete, but the words didn't feel like yours. The handwriting was your own, but the thoughts, the ideas, they didn't match what you remembered feeling. Some entries were entirely unfamiliar, as if they had been written by someone else who had taken over your life for brief periods. Then, the really odd part began. You searched through old records, things like job applications, tax documents, and legal papers. There were entire years that had no record. Your name appeared, but it was as if you disappeared during certain months or even years. In some records, your dates of birth seemed different, or you were listed as living in a place you had no recollection of. People from your past, when contacted, seemed strangely distant, like they didn't remember you the same way you remembered them. One old colleague, someone who had been close to you during your early career, barely recognized you. When you spoke to him about shared experiences, his responses were confused, as though you were recounting someone else's life. He smiled politely, but there was something off about the way he spoke, like he didn't want to acknowledge the confusion. It was as if the past had been rewritten. Your search through the past only deepened the mystery. The more you dug, the more the pieces of your life seemed to vanish, leaving behind a ghostly outline of what should have been. It felt as though someone, or something, had been erasing parts of your existence, reshaping them to fit a narrative you didn't understand. Was it just a trick of memory? Was your mind playing games with you? Or was something far darker at play? One night, you couldn't sleep. You found yourself sitting in front of the computer, staring at an old family tree document you'd created years ago. You scrolled through it aimlessly, feeling a growing sense of dread. As you reached the end, a name appeared in the margin, a name that shouldn't have been there. Your own name, written in a different handwriting, almost as if someone else had added it. That was when it hit you. You weren't just losing your past. Someone had been remaking it. Someone was in control of your history, shaping it without your knowledge or consent. The creeping realization washed over you. Your life had been altered. And as you tried to make sense of it, the truth became undeniable. There was something or someone out there controlling your every move, erasing your past as they saw fit. The warning from a stranger. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. You had decided to stop by the cafe on the corner, a quiet place you frequented when you needed to clear your head. The rain had started falling lightly outside, and the steam rising from your coffee cup created a brief mist that fogged the edges of your thoughts. You were sitting alone by the window, looking out at the rain, trying to make sense of the confusion swirling in your mind. But the moment she entered, everything shifted. She was older than you, mid-50s maybe, with a worn expression on her face, one that seemed to carry more than the years could account for. Her eyes were wide with fear, darting around the room as though she were searching for something, or someone. Her gaze landed on you, and without a second's hesitation, she walked straight over, as if drawn by some unseen force. At first, you thought she was going to ask for help or give you a passing compliment, like so many strangers had done. But her presence was different. There was a sense of urgency in her movements, an energy that rippled through the air. "You don't belong here," she whispered, her voice low, tremulous, but piercing. "They're watching. They are watching." You froze, unsure how to respond. You glanced around, half expecting to see someone observing you, but there was no one who stood out. The cafe seemed the same as always, quiet, unremarkable. The patrons, absorbed in their own world, hadn't even glanced in her direction. Before you could speak, she leaned in closer, her breath shallow. "They erased you before. They'll do it again. You need to leave. Now." Her words were rushed, as if she feared the very act of speaking them aloud. Your mind raced. The notion that someone had been watching you, that your past had been tampered with, it was becoming more and more real. But who was they? And why would anyone be watching you? "Who are you?" you asked, your voice barely a whisper, the tension in the air suddenly feeling stifling. She opened her mouth as if about to speak, but then, as if hearing something from afar, she froze. Her eyes darted toward the door, her breath catching in her throat. She looked back at you, her face stricken with terror, then turned sharply and fled the cafe without another word. You stood up immediately, instinctively following her, but when you reached the door, she was gone, vanished into the rain-soaked street. You looked left, then right, scanning the sidewalk for any sign of her, but there was nothing. She had disappeared as if she had never existed. Confused and unnerved, you stepped back inside, hoping to make sense of what had just happened. The barista behind the counter barely acknowledged you, her eyes focused on the cash register. You glanced at the other patrons, but they continued their conversations, oblivious to the encounter that had just unfolded. You couldn't shake the feeling that something deeply unsettling had just occurred. That woman's words echoed in your mind. "They're watching," and an overwhelming sense of dread pressed against your chest. Who was she? Why did she warn you? And what was it about her that made you feel like she knew exactly what was happening to you? Back at your apartment that evening, you replayed the interaction in your head. Something about the way she looked at you, her eyes, was unforgettable. They were filled with a kind of recognition, but it wasn't the kind you could place. It was as though she had seen you before, in a way that no one else had. You tried to brush it off, thinking you might have overreacted, but deep down you knew there was more to her warning than just a random encounter. And somehow, you sensed that the woman's appearance was no coincidence. It was the first piece of a puzzle you didn't yet understand, but one that was slowly revealing itself. The next day, you went back to the cafe, but the barista didn't seem to remember the woman, and the footage from the security cameras was mysteriously missing. It was as if the woman had never been there at all. You were left with one haunting question. Who was she? And what did she know about you that you didn't? The sixth sign, a glitch in reality. The unease that had been creeping up on you for days suddenly took on a new form. It wasn't just the strange behaviors of those around you anymore. It was something more insidious, a quiet, gnawing realization that something about your reality was off. It started subtly at first, small details you could brush off if you weren't paying attention. A conversation you swore you'd had yesterday, but when you encountered the same person the next day, it felt like you were repeating the exact same words, the exact same gestures. It wasn't déjà vu. It was like you were stuck on a loop, trapped in a moment that refused to progress. And then there was the man at the bus stop. For days now, you'd seen him crossing the street at exactly 2:17 p.m. The first time, you thought it was just a coincidence. But then you noticed the second time, and the third. Each day, right at 2:17 p.m., he would appear, dressed in a dark jacket, carrying a briefcase, his face expressionless, as though his only purpose in life was to cross that street at that exact moment. You began timing your walks, testing it. 2:17 p.m. came and went, and there he was again, stepping off the curb at the same exact spot, his eyes never meeting yours. At first, you laughed it off, but soon it became hard to ignore. He wasn't just repeating his actions, he was locked in a pattern like a character in a play, and you were the only one who seemed to notice. Then came the barista. It wasn't just that she smiled and greeted you the same way every single time you entered. It was how the smile was always the same, slightly too wide, eyes too focused, like she had rehearsed it. The words she spoke every time were exactly the same. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was as if she was programmed to act that way. The same coffee, the same smile, the same polite small talk about the weather. Every single day. You tried breaking the cycle. The next day, you walked into the cafe and ordered a different drink. But when she handed you your coffee, it was still the same one you always ordered. She smiled, handed it over, and repeated her greeting like she hadn't heard a word you'd said. The world was starting to feel artificial. You couldn't ignore it anymore. Everything seemed to be happening in carefully timed, perfectly choreographed steps. Your movements, the people you passed, the way people interacted with you. It was as if you were in a simulation, trapped in a loop, performing the same actions over and over again. The realization came slowly, at first just a whisper in your mind. But by now it had become undeniable. The world felt too predictable. It felt too designed. There was no spontaneity, no chaos, just perfect order, just perfect repetition. That night you stood in front of your bathroom mirror, staring at your reflection, trying to make sense of what was happening. The more you focused, the more you realized that you didn't feel quite right. You looked like yourself, but something was different. Your features were sharper, almost too perfect. The lines in your face, the way your eyes gleamed, there was something unnatural about it. You blinked, and in that fleeting second, something changed. A flash of something. An unfamiliar man stared back at you. The reflection wasn't you, not completely. His expression was stiff, empty, almost hollow, like a puppet with no soul. You froze, your breath catching in your throat. When you blinked again, the reflection returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. But it had happened. You could feel it in your bones. You weren't just seeing things. Something, someone, had distorted reality itself. You rushed to the window, tearing open the blinds. The streets outside were quiet, as they always were, but you could feel the weight of someone watching you. The silence was deafening. The world outside seemed like a stage set for a play. The illusion was cracking. You weren't the only one who had noticed. Something, someone, was starting to make their presence known. The cracks in the world were deepening, and you could feel yourself slipping further into something you couldn't understand. You ran your hands over your face, feeling a cold sweat break out on your skin. This wasn't real, but if that was true, then what was? 6. The truth. You're not human. You couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Your mind buzzed with the fragments of a truth you couldn't quite grasp. It was in the air, in the way the world felt too perfect, too staged, and in your reflection, the brief moment of strangeness that had flashed across your face. You tried to ignore it, tried to drown out the gnawing unease that had been festering inside you for days. But the truth was relentless. It clawed at you from the corners of your mind, demanding to be acknowledged. It wasn't just the glitches. It wasn't just the strange behavior of people. It was something deeper. You were the anomaly. That night you couldn't sleep. The weight of the world pressed down on you, suffocating you with its unreality. Your thoughts turned inwards, spiraling into the darkest corners of your mind. That's when you found the letter. You'd never seen it before, but there it was, hidden under a stack of old papers, written in your own hand. At first you thought it was some kind of prank, but as you read the words you felt your stomach churn, your heart skip a beat. They erased you before. Don't let them do it again. The words seemed to pulse with a life of their own, sending a cold chill down your spine. Erased. You tried to recall the time you wrote it, but the memory wouldn't come. The handwriting was yours, but the words were foreign, terrifying. You felt a surge of panic. What did it mean? Why didn't you remember writing this? And what exactly was erased? Frantically, you rifled through more of the papers, desperately searching for answers, for something, anything, that could make sense of the madness. The deeper you dug, the more unsettling the discoveries became. Notes about tests, references to adjustments and modifications, and finally a series of dates, long periods of time where there were no records of your existence, no proof you had ever been alive. The truth hit you like a ton of bricks. You weren't just an older man with charm and confidence. You were a construct, an experiment. Someone, something, had been manipulating your entire existence, erasing and rewriting parts of your life to fit a narrative that wasn't your own. You sat down, your head spinning. Your life, your very identity, wasn't real. It was a carefully designed illusion, a set of parameters created by someone, or something, outside of your understanding. Every relationship, every job, every experience you'd had was a piece of the puzzle, curated to keep you unaware of the truth. The flashes of memory that felt wrong. They weren't mistakes. They were the holes in your past, the areas that had been altered or erased to keep you from discovering what you truly were. The man you were, the version of yourself you'd believed to be true, was nothing but a fabrication. In that moment, a cold clarity settled over you. You weren't human. You never had been. But what were you then? You leaned back against the wall, your mind racing to comprehend the enormity of what you'd just uncovered. You were an experiment, something engineered, something controlled. You were a part of a larger plan, a part of something far more complex and sinister than you could imagine. And the question that now consumed you, the question that would not let you rest, was simple. Who had done this to you? Who had created you? The answer, like everything else, was just out of reach. But you knew one thing for certain. They were watching, and they weren't going to let you remember for long. 7. The final sign. They are coming. It was in the silence that the world began to unravel. The moment the truth of your existence had fully settled, the fabric of reality itself started to tear at the seams. The world around you, once so vivid, now felt artificial, like a stage set with actors playing their parts. You could feel it now, the presence of something or someone, waiting, watching. As you stood there, processing the chaos swirling inside your head, you noticed it. A flicker, a brief glitch in your peripheral vision. The man walking his dog on the sidewalk. He stuttered, his movement jumping forward by a few seconds, as if time had skipped a beat. The woman at the cafe, the one who always greeted you with that knowing smile. Her eyes locked onto yours for a second too long, as if she were waiting for you to react. And the streetlights, they blinked erratically, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own accord. You weren't imagining it. The world was glitching. And then, it happened. The ground beneath your feet shifted. Not physically, no. This wasn't a change in the landscape. It was a shift in perception, as if you were seeing the world for the first time through a cracked lens, and you could see the fractures. The cracks in the reality you once thought solid. You looked up, and there it was. The shadow. At first, it was just a a dark silhouette emerging from the corner of your eye. Then it began to move, slowly, deliberately, toward you. Your breath caught in your throat as the figure drew closer. Tall, imposing, cloaked in shadows. Every instinct told you to run, but your feet felt rooted to the spot. You couldn't move. It wasn't fear that held you there. It was a magnetic pull, an irresistible force that drew your attention forward. Then you heard the voice. You weren't supposed to remember. The words sliced through the stillness of the night like a blade, cold and precise. The voice was low, authoritative, but it carried a weight of something ancient, something beyond comprehension. It was as if the very air around you vibrated with the force of the words. The figure stepped forward, its presence overwhelming. The world seemed to bend around it, the colors draining from the streets, leaving everything in shades of gray. Your heart pounded in your chest as you locked eyes with the shadow. There was no warmth, no humanity in those eyes, only an infinite void, an emptiness that stretched beyond time and space. You weren't meant to remember, the figure repeated, its voice now colder, more insistent. You were a tool, a creation, a part of a plan that should have remained hidden. The words hit you like a physical blow. Your chest tightened, a sharp pain seizing your lungs as the truth became undeniable. Whoever or whatever this figure was, they knew you. They knew you more intimately than anyone ever could. But it wasn't just you they were concerned about. It was the memory you had started to reclaim, the memory they had tried so hard to erase. The figure reached out, its hand glowing with an eerie light, and for the briefest moment you thought it might end right there. That your mind, your very existence, would be wiped away, erased again like a forgotten dream. But before it could reach you, a sudden noise shattered the stillness, a sharp, jarring sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. The figure flinched, its form flickering for a moment, as if it too was caught in the glitch. And then, without warning, it vanished. You were left standing alone in the middle of the street, your mind reeling, your heart racing. The world snapped back into place with a sharp clarity, the colors of the street returning to normal, the mundane sounds of the city rushing back into your ears. But something had changed. You weren't the same person anymore. The realization hit you with crushing finality. They are coming. Whoever or whatever had orchestrated your existence, they were no longer content with keeping you in the dark. The game had shifted. You were no longer a puppet on their strings. You were a threat they would stop at nothing to eliminate. You glanced around, but the streets were empty now, eerily silent. You had no time to process what had just happened. They were coming for you, and there was no telling what they would do to make sure you never remembered again. The chase had begun.